Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the live Facebook Q&A with me, Professor Michael Scott, from here, my office at the University of Warwick. As we're getting very excited this evening, we are going to be putting on the Warwick Classics Society. The undergraduates in our classics department, the Warwick Classics Society, are putting on their performance of Aristophanes' Frogs this evening in the Warwick Arts Centre main theatre just across the way from me. We're all going to be going to see that. I hope some of you may be coming along too. If not, it's not too late to get your ticket. It's kick-off at 7ish this evening at Warwick Arts Centre. You can book online. And then tomorrow we have 550 school children from across the country coming to join us here at the University of Warwick for a day of lectures surrounding another performance of Aristophanes' Frogs as we really get to grips with the play. So it's great fun this week here at the University of Warwick with lots and lots going on, and most importantly, lots of you coming onto campus to join us in our enjoyment of the ancient world. Hello, good afternoon to you. How are you doing? Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to have you here. So we've had another set of great questions in for this Facebook Live Q&A, and we are kicking off with Maria Marku has come back in asking if you could travel back in time. Hello, Elizabeth. How are you doing? Hello, hello, hello. If you could travel back in time, which mystery of antiquity would you wish to unravel? Okay, there's a great question, Maria. Thank you very much. If you could go back in time, which mystery of antiquity would you unravel? Well, where do we start with that? What would you guys like to unravel? What would you like to be answered that has never yet been answered? Well, on the one hand, something close to my heart. We've been talking about the Delphic Oracle for the last couple of weeks on and off. Hello, Linda. How are you doing? You're having scones and a cup of tea at the moment. I'm so very glad indeed. One of the great mysteries close to my heart, man. How did the Delphic oracular consultation take place? Kind of what was going on when you were in the room? We don't have a single ancient open. So, fingers crossed that we could understand that if we were able to go back in the past and engage with some mysteries that you would like to unravel. That you could join us again from Brazil. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining in. Other mysteries that we would want to unravel. Where is the body of Alexander the Great? Would be another great one. We know that it was taken by his general Ptolemy to Alexandria in Egypt on the north coast of Egypt. We know it was there in a specially built tomb for centuries afterwards. That Julius Caesar and the Emperor Augustus, the Roman Emperor Augustus, saw it. But the body went missing in the 5th or so centuries AD. And there have been multiple theories about where it went. Was it left? Put forward that it was sold off as the bones of St. Mark that were then transported to Venice, and actually the bones of St. Mark that's in St. Mark's Square in the Duomo in St. Mark's Square in Venice could actually be the bones of Alexander the Great. Who knows? But wouldn't it be great to be able to solve that mystery? Elizabeth, are we going to be doing any more audiobooks? Oh, interesting question. Well, we haven't done an audiobook of Ancient Worlds yet, but kind of hopefully we'll have that done in the future. What about other mysteries of antiquity? Well, I mean, another one that I was talking about with my students just this week in our Ancient Global History class, which is where we we need to know how did these ancient communities connect with one another? Did they come face to face with one another? And there are these tantalizing moments captured in the sources where something is happening and we'd dearly love to know more. So what happens in 166 AD when in the Chinese sources, in the Huhan Shu, the book of the later Han, it records that Romans turned up, coming up through modern-day Vietnam into China, and got the Chinese sources record as being named Andun, to offer tribute, to offer presents, to offer phosphorus horn, tortoiseshell, nothing that really excited the Chinese emperor. And in fact, he sort of came away from the meeting going, well, this Roman place, we thought it was all amazing, full of amazing stuff, but perhaps it isn't if this is the best that they can provide. And as a result, the Chinese were less interested in making direct connections with the Roman world after that period. But were those Romans who turned up in China in 166 AD really there on the behest of the Roman Emperor, or were they just local traders who were chancing it, knowing that claiming to be there on behalf of the Roman Emperor would do them no harm? So we'd love to know more about that. We'd love to know more about this guy called Mice that we hear about in the ancient source of Ptolemy, his geography, that he, in about maybe the 120s AD, he sent a team to make it all the way to China, to try and establish direct commercial connections. And that team supposedly got all the way to Central Asia, to modern-day Afghanistan. It got over the Pamir Mountains, and then we hear it's caught up in the Chinese sources that it's taken hostage by the Chinese army and taken to the emperor, where perhaps they met in front of the emperor. And again, there was this direct connection between Rome and China, but we just don't know more. The rest of the sources is entirely fragmentary. So that, so many things that we'd like to know if we possibly could. Hi, how are you doing, kind of thing. What was the real use of Stonehenge? There's another question to be asked. Absolutely, one of the mysteries of antiquity. Maria, what a great question as Scott is really thinking, and we'd love to know. There are so many that we'd love to know, and perhaps in some ways it's the joy of the study of the ancient world that there are some mysteries that we sort of know in our hearts are going to remain a mystery forevermore. Hello, Vera, how are you doing? Thank you so much for joining in this live Q&A with me, Professor Michael Scott. So thank you, Maria, for that question. We've got another question from Alison Lyons that's come in on a very different note. Is it true that Romans ate lying down? Well, there we go. Yes, indeed it was the case that rich Romans, if they were kind of having one of their spectacular feasts being held in the dining room of their luxurious homes, the triclinium as it was known, they would be lying down on couches. Now, I don't mean lying down as we might lie down in bed. These are couches that they can rest on, sort of with their left arm propping them up so that they are able to converse with the rest of the room and use one of their hands, their right hand normally, to eat and drink with. Everything would be eaten with their fingers, so everything would be cut up into sort of bite sizes, and slaves would be going around often washing hands. Some of the sources talk about how you start your dinner, if you're a rich, luxurious Roman, by dipping your hands in icy cold water, and then you move on to the delicacies that are in front of you. And in fact, that idea of lying down we see in the Greek world as well. Kind of when the Greeks came to the symposium, the Greek drinking party, they would too be lying on couches, leaning on their left arms, and then drinking and eating with their right. And in fact, we were doing that just this week in Warwick undergraduate teaching in our Greek culture and society module. We had our first years recreating an ancient symposium. I don't know whether you saw on Instagram, I tweeted a photo of some of the replica Greek drinking cups that we use to fill with Ribena, I assure you, to let the students actually try out drinking from these things in the position that an ancient Greek would have done, to understand something of the difficulty of drinking from these vessels, but also then thinking about how you engaged with the images on them. And I've got here, I brought them in, here is our replica drinking vessel that we use. This has been recreated for us by fabulous potters who specialise in recreating the ancient world, replicas of material from the ancient world. And here it is in the exact same shape, size and decoration. This is the famous Ezekias, 5th century BCE vessel with a picture of Dionysus. There he is in the centre on his boat, having turned nasty pirates who tried to kidnap him into dolphins. And so you can see this is an incredibly difficult vessel to drink from because of the wide rim that you've got here, making it impossible to not really spill stuff unless you're very careful. And also fundamentally, obviously the picture here in the centre would be obscured by the wine until you got to the end of it and drank everything that was in your cup. So we had great fun with the first years this week doing that. So the Romans too, not necessarily using such difficult drinking, whereas the Greeks liked making things difficult for themselves. But the Romans would definitely be drinking wine. Joyce, that's an answer to your question. Did the Romans only drink wine? Wine and water would have been available at the Roman dinner party, but there they would have been lying down. And in fact, if you weren't lying down, it was signifying something of your lower status. Hello, Ansi. Hello, Linda. How are you doing? It would mean that you were either young, you were not yet an adult and taking up your full kind of adult citizen place in society, both in the Greek world and in the Roman world. Or indeed, it could mean you had less than free status. So you might have been a freed slave, for instance. And if you were standing and moving around the group, then you were most definitely of lower status. So very, very different to how we imagine things today. But yes, lying down was how you wanted to be, or reclining, as it was put instead, reclining. That's for the wealthy, of course. I mean, we have to imagine the vast numbers of the Roman world, and particularly living in the city of Rome, who were much poorer, living not in massive villas with their own little triclinium dining rooms, but in multi-storey apartment blocks that we know existed in the city of Rome, going up sometimes 10 stories, where we know the conditions were absolutely appalling. We hear about the ancient sources talk about having to get up to the top floor of one of these things where the roof was leaking and the rats were running around, and frankly you didn't want to be on the top floor. The penthouse was most definitely not on the top floor, because if a fire broke out in one of these multi-storey apartment blocks, you had absolutely no chance. They used to have shops in all the ground floors with all the baking ovens and all the fires going, so fires did break out very regularly. In these sorts of places, in these sorts of homes, the best people could look forward to at the dinner would be to sort of be sitting on the floor somewhere with a rather kind of unappealing bowl of vegetables, and maybe some bread, maybe some barley, something like that, to mix in with it at the end of their day, the poor things. So not reclining in any way, enjoying themselves as the elites would be. Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining in the live Q&A, and thank you very much, Alison, for that great question. Okay, we are moving on to a whole series of questions that have come out this week, asking about oracles and the different forms of oracles that kicked off from our discussion of the Delphic oracle when I was up in Lytham St Anne's just a couple of weeks ago to give my presidential lecture for the Lytham St Anne's Classical Association branch that I work with up there, that are absolutely fantastic people. And don't forget that they are running their Lytham St Anne's Classics competition right now. The closing date is tomorrow, so if you are at school and one of your schools has been thinking about entering this, it's not too late to get in an entry. You need to get in a video entry of kind of your top 3 objects from the ancient world, and those will be judged first by a committee of the Lytham St Anne's, led by the founder of the group, Katrina Kelly, and then I'll be coming up to Lytham on the weekend of the 9th and 10th of February to judge the final. So I'm very much looking forward to that. So not too late to get your choices in now. If you can, go to www.lsaclassics.com if you want to enter that competition. But we were talking about oracles. And there's a great question came in from Paul Caroline Nicklin. Why were the oracles always women? It's great that women were in charge for once, as she puts it, but why were they always women? Did not men get involved in this process? Well, great question, really interesting question, because we so often focus on the oracle at Delphi as the premier, if you like, oracle, the most famous oracle to survive from antiquity. And very famously, there was a Pythian priestess who was always a woman, who was there sitting over that 3-legged stool, somehow engaging with the god. And that might have been through inhaling fumes from the floor, it might have been through going into some kind of trance, it might have been through a much more if you like, less kind of dramatic religious explanation, and maybe just putting on a good show for the consultants coming. But was this always the case? Now, it's explained as being a woman at Delphi because there is a need, it is felt, to have the connection between the human world and the divine world as unimpeded as possible. And as it's explained by some of the ancient sources, particularly the later sources, Plutarch, who was actually a priest of Apollo at Delphi, that women were felt to be the least impeding conduit, as it were, between the human and divine worlds. In fact, while the Pythian priestess had to be a woman from the local village at Delphi, it was often felt that if she was not a highly educated or a wealthy woman, but actually from one of the simpler families, the kind of less well-off families, she would be even less of an impediment of that connection between the human and divine worlds. But that's not to say that oracles, and particularly Pythia priestesses that somehow engaged between the human and divine worlds, had to be women, because oracular consultation could be done in any number of ways. Only at Delphi and one or two other places does it seem to be done through an individual who is somehow inspired by the god to give their responses. If you go to the oracle of Zeus, for instance, up at Dodona in northern Greece, there you have an entirely different system in which male priests of Zeus at Dodona listened to the rustling of leaves on a tree, a sacred tree, and interpreted that to give the responses of Zeus to particular oracular questions. Or it may be different oracular families lived at certain locations. So at Olympia, where we know about because of the Olympic Games, it also had a family, an oracular family at Olympia, who read entrails, read the signs on particular parts of animals that were sacrificed to the gods, and then read to discover the will of Zeus. And in fact, there were lots of different other ways in which oracles were done in different parts of the world. So we do hear about some other female priestesses who occupy that position, that conduit between male and between the human world and the divine world. So at Argos, for instance, the oracles were women, but actually women tend to be in the minority. That a lot more of the places we hear of oracular families in charge, whether they're reading signs or whether some of them are being that conduit between human and divine worlds, it is often men that take up that role. So kind of Delphi becomes, if you like, even more unusual in the Greek world in the kind of way it gives the Pythian priestess, this woman, such an unparalleled position of importance. Were there priests, male priests around her? Well, again, the sources are so difficult to reconcile. They're so fragmentary. And instead we have to think about perhaps it working differently at different points in time. So we do hear in the later sources about these positions, these prophets, kind of priests. We hear about these hosioi, these holy people, these male holy priests that might have been around the oracle at one point or another, performing some kind of role, perhaps interpreting the frenzied responses of the Pythian priestess, or perhaps kind of helping shape those responses as they then got delivered to the consultants. So there's lots of possibilities, and there were definitely male priests around. Plutarch, as we mentioned, that great source, is a male priest around. Good afternoon, Samantha, how are you doing? Around an important part of the kind of priestly family at Delphi, but definitely not getting involved in the actual communication between the human and divine worlds themselves. So there we go. Thank you very much, Paul Caroline, for that question. That was great, about the different kinds of oracles that we see. And that got followed up actually with another question that we had from last week, which I didn't get a chance to answer, which was from J. Matthew Reaver, talking about how does Delphi compare to oracles like the Sibyl. So the Sibyl, now what are we doing here? This is another female oracular priestess of a different sort. Kind of, Linda, how are you doing? Did they expect a better response from the oracle if it was a full moon, for instance? Well, kind of, you could only go to the oracle at Delphi on very, very certain days, and that was actually Apollo's birthday, kind of each month for 9 months of the year, and then for 3 months of the year, the winter months, Apollo was said to go off on holiday to live with the Hyperboreans, and Dionysus took over at Delphi, and no consultations could take place. And in fact, they were very specific that you couldn't consult the oracular priestess on days outside of these very specific consultation days. So kind of those were the days when you had to, when it was possible to consult the oracle. But even on those days, you had to make sure that the god was willing. So there was this crazy ceremony at Delphi where a goat got sprinkled with water, and if the goat sort of shuddered, it was said to signify that the god was willing to undertake a consultation. And we hear in the later sources that in an effort to make sure that the goat shuddered, they would pour not just drops of water over it, but pour buckets of icy water over this poor goat to make sure it shuddered, to enable it to kind of give the go-ahead for the day's consultation. So even when you went to Delphi on the specific day that you knew was supposed to be a consultation day, you couldn't guarantee until you were there on the day that the consultation would go ahead. In terms of whether or not an oracular consultation of any form, so if you were cutting up an animal and reading its entrails, whether that was said to be right or not, or to be taken very seriously or not, depended entirely on whether the particular ritual processes in that particular sanctuary and at that particular oracle had been followed properly. Had everything been done in order as it was supposed to be done, in order to ensure that what was then seen in the entrails of the animal, for instance, was really to be interpreted as coming from the gods. So not so much to do with the kind of natural environment, as it were, but a need for the human constituents, the human community around the sanctuary, to feel that all the steps had been followed correctly in order to get close to the divine. So thank you, Linda, for that question. Absolutely great. But we're going back to J. Matthews Reeves' question about what about these sibyls? These are oracular priestesses, prophetesses, uttering revelations while they are in some kind of divine frenzy coming from the gods. And we hear about them in two major places. The first is the Sibellyne oracles, which is a collection, a massive collection work of these utterances. These are coming from a variety of different sibyls, a variety of different sites, and a variety of different times that were compiled all together, surviving for us today, kind of from the 6th, 7th centuries CE. So these cross huge ranges of cultures, traditions, indeed even religions, and they're a complete mix, and they could be read, consulted, thought about, and seem to be revered in lots of ways. The ones that we hear about more often, in fact, are kind of almost more famous, not the Sibelline oracles, but the Sibelline books, and those were in Rome. Now, there were said to be, or thought to be by the 1st century, 10 major sibyls, 10 major prophetesses that lived or had lived in different parts of the wider ancient Mediterranean world, and they were all contributing through to the Sibelline oracles collection. But the Sibelline books in Rome were offered very famously to the last king of Rome by one of those sibyls, the Cumaean sibyl. And supposedly she turned up and offered these books to the king, who was a very proud Tarquinius Superbus, the most arrogant man. And of course he was the last king of Rome because Rome revolted against him, so he doesn't get a very good rep in the history books. And he initially turned down her offer. He said, I'm not paying that exorbitant price you want for those books. So she went away and burned some of them and came back asking for the remaining few the same amount of money, and supposedly Tarquinius once again turned her down, so she went away and burnt some more and came back with just the last two and asked the same price again, at which point he relented, bought those books, and they became absolutely central to the Roman state, even after the era of kings had long passed. These Sibylline books were kept in state in one of the major temples of the city of Rome, and they were opened and they were consulted at particularly crucial and potentially catastrophic moments for the Roman state, when it was really facing danger, huge danger for its own continued existence. They would turn to these Sibylline books in order to try and find some salvation. So when, for instance, Rome was plagued by plague, famine, when Hannibal was almost at the gates of Rome after his great victory at Cannae over the Romans in the late 3rd century BCE, the Sibylline books were consulted, and as a result Rome decided what it might do in response. But tragically, those Sibylline books were burnt in the 4th century CE. Completely lost to us today. So we only have the stories of how much they were revered within the ancient world, rather than the books themselves, which is so tantalizing, and we would absolutely love to have them. Kind of, hi Hugh, how are you doing? Thanks, Linda, I'm so glad you enjoyed the answer to the question. Thank you very much indeed. So yes, those are the sibyls, and they cross over with Delphi, because at Delphi there is supposed to be the rock of the sibyl. So there is a kind of crossover and connection with Delphi, and particularly with Delphian Sibyl. So kind of in that sense, there are major important female oracular priestesses outside of just places like Delphi or Argos. There are these greater collection of sibyls that cross the entire ancient Mediterranean world, whose utterances get collected in these volumes, both the ones that were thought that were incredibly important to Rome, but also another set, a wider set, the Sibylline oracles, which get compiled much later in the 6th, 7th centuries, as we were saying, and which do survive for us in fragments. Ursula at Delphi, was it a live queue and could anyone get a consultation and was it free? Thank you very much for that question. No. So it was definitely a live queue. You had to turn up on the day that you knew a consultation should be taking place. So you probably had to, given the problems of journeying to Delphi, particularly if you were coming from far away, you'd probably definitely try to get there a couple of days in advance. So you're probably there camping or trying to stay in some kind of accommodation that's available in the settlement around the sanctuary, waiting for the day. Then when the day came, anyone could consult, but you had to form an orderly queue in a very particular order. So local Delphians, they got in the queue first. They got to go to the head of the queue because it was their oracle. Then it was members or people who had come from cities who were members of the Amphictyoni. The Amphictyoni, the kind of supra-regional grouping that took an interest in the running of Delphi. So if you were from one of those Amphictyonic states, then you got to get in next. Then it was if you were from any kind of other Greek city or state, and then it was everyone else. And you could get permission to skip the queue, so you could be given the honour from Delphi. You could be offered kind of an honourable mention, if you like, which allowed you to skip the queue and move to the front of your section, not to the front of the entire queue, but to the front of your section. So if you were a Greek, but you weren't a member of the Amphictyoni and you had the right to skip the queue, then you moved to the front of the Greeks section, for instance. Hi Felix, how are you doing? Thank you for joining in. Filippo, what exactly did the Romans invent that we still see in present day? Interesting question from Filippo, thank you very much. Well, I mean, here in Britain, for instance, we're still kind of using some of the pathways of Roman roads. So kind of when we're saying inventing, or rather they're perfecting lots of engineering techniques that they're then utilising and mass producing, if you like. The perfect Roman road has sort of laid the foundations for the ways many of our major kind of arterial roads run today. But one of the building materials that the Romans really did seem to invent is cement. They invented cement. They had cement. And if you go to the Pantheon in Rome today and you look at the dome of that great building, it is a cement dome made with ancient Roman cement. And the Romans had a particular magic ingredient to their cement, which was what's in Italian known as pozzolana, which comes from the volcanic rock on which Rome is built. And this magic ingredient, when you mix it into your cement mix, makes cement harden very quickly, but amazingly even harden underwater. So the Romans didn't just invent cement, they invented waterproof cement, and this allowed them to do amazing things. So build massive underwater harbour installations, for instance, but equally it meant that the cement that they put into buildings that were exposed to the outside world, to the rain, when it does come in Rome, it still does come in Rome sometimes, the rain actually made the cement not wear away and get weaker over time, but get harder and stronger over time. So Roman cement actually improved in its constituency over time, thanks to interaction with the elements, and as a result, that is why you get Roman cement buildings surviving for as long as they have done. And the other great quality of Roman cement was that depending on what they mixed into it, they could make it a much heavier material or a lighter material. And going back to the Pantheon, with that roof with the dome that slowly creeps inwards, it is the kind of widest unsupported concrete dome kind of, well, at its time anywhere in the world, and still today, it manages not to fall in on itself, because as you go up through the layers of the dome and get towards the centre, the materials they were making the concrete out of get lighter and lighter and lighter, so the concrete itself gets lighter and lighter and lighter as it moves towards the centre. So there we go, a Roman invention that we kind of think of as something as being a part of the modern world, but actually is something that has been, that the Romans got there first and absolutely perfected, and frankly they made better cement then than we do today. Hello Maria, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you were here in time for your question that we had at the beginning. Great that you could join in, and thank you for that question. So thank you Matthew Reaver for asking about Sibyls. That was absolutely great. Yikes, we are out of time. It's 4:30 already. I haven't had a chance to talk about some of the other things that have been going on, so we'll keep the in the news and the what's on for next week. But I just wanted to take this brief moment to introduce you before we go to, here he is, the Lego classicist me, kind of made very kindly by a Lego classicist that you may have been seeing over Twitter, that's been launched in the last couple of weeks, kind of moving forward for you to see. This is me at the University of Warwick. I've got my bag, my satchel kind of, and my notebook in hand. This is the Lego classicist me that now has a huge pride of place here in my office. So thank you, Liam, the Lego classicist, for making me part of the Lego classicist family. It's a huge honour and absolutely loving it. And already lots of people have been commenting kind of as they come into the office to see it. Kind of thank you. Yes, indeed. He's kind of absolutely cute, and kind of we're very, very happy to have him. Although people have been doing weird things on Twitter and having him jumping out of cakes. People have found out my love of my sweet tooth and my love of cake. So kind of I can't deny it. Absolutely the case. So thank you so much, Liam, again, for making me part of the Lego Classicist family. Thank you everyone for joining in for this half hour. I'm sorry if there have been a couple of connection problems as well this hour. We'll try and do our best to fix that in future weeks. A quick one in from Isabel. Did the Romans make statues using their cement? Ooh, interesting. I don't think we have copies of cement statues. I will have to have a think about that. I don't think they did. No, it was mainly for buildings and for superstructures rather than for statues. But they did like making loads of copies of Greek originals. So they would be using kind of materials to be able to make those copies, clay, and then kind of turning those into molds that they could then turn into marble molds, marble sculptures, but not cement, I don't think. Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you for being part of this week. And we'll see you again next week, Thursday the 31st of January at 4 o'clock. Have a great rest of your week and weekend. Take care.